The Riverlands didn't announce itself. It simply was, a wound in the earth that had forgotten how to close. Neo hit the ground hard, one knee slamming into mud that smelled of iron and old rain. The sky above him was wrong, not the bruised orange of a simulated sunset or the clinical white of the real world. This was gray in a way that felt deliberate, like the color had been bled out slowly over centuries. 2 armies had been through this valley recently. He could tell by the wheel ruts driven deep into the road, the abandoned cook fire still threading smoke into the cold air, and the bodies. 3 of them, face down in the ditch beside a broken cart. Nobody had bothered to move them. He stood slowly, adjusting to the weight of the place. In the Matrix, the world revealed itself to him as code, cascading green numerals, structural logic, the seams between what was real and what was constructed. He had learned to read that language the way a musician reads sheet music, instinctively, without thinking. He looked now, letting that perception open like an eye behind his eyes. What he saw made him go very still. Westeros wasn't code, or rather it was, but not the clean, recursive architecture of machine-built simulation. This was something layered and breathing, ancient script wound through stone and soil, and the bare winter trees lining the road. It pulsed, it had intention. Whatever underpinned the reality of this place hadn't been written by engineers. It had grown the way bone grows, slowly, painfully, without asking permission. He closed that perception down and focused on the immediate. The cart had been carrying grain. Someone had hacked it open rather than unloading it properly, scattering pale kernels across the mud. Military thinking, take what you can carry, destroy what you can't. The bodies wore rough-spun wool, not armor, farmers or close enough. The killing had been efficient and entirely without hesitation, which told him more about the people who'd done it than any insignia would have. He checked himself. Black clothing, torn at the shoulder from the fall. No weapons, no phone, no earpiece, no connection to anything that had ever known his name. Wherever the rupture had dropped him, it was thorough. A crow landed on the nearest body, regarded him with one oil-black eye, and went about its business. He started walking. The road ran south between leafless hedgerows, and within a quarter mile he could hear it, the distant, irregular percussion of a settlement still breathing, smoke, the smell of animals. Somewhere ahead, people were still alive and trying to stay that way, which meant information, and information was the only resource that had ever actually mattered. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want them to see them in down in the comments below. May the Force be with you. He walked toward the smoke and let this strange, bleeding world fold itself around him, watching the code beneath it pulse like something that knew he was there. The village had a name once. Whatever it was, the Lannister outriders hadn't asked before they'd finished with it. Neo came over the rise and stopped. Perhaps 40 structures, half of them still standing. The inn at the center of the crossroads had its door hanging open, one hinge torn free, golden light spilling out into the gray afternoon like something embarrassed to be seen. Around it, the evidence of a raid conducted without urgency. Overturned troughs, a dead horse already beginning to stiffen, grain sacks slashed and emptied. A systematic gutting, done by men who knew exactly how much they could take and how long they had to take it. The survivors were gathered in the inn's yard, 11 people. He counted them without thinking about it, the way he'd once counted agents. They watched him come down the road with the particular wariness of people who had recently learned that strangers meant harm. A woman in her 50s stood slightly in front of the others, not deliberately, he thought, just because stepping back wasn't something she'd ever learned to do. She held a woodsman's axe across her body with the grip of someone who knew how to use it and was deciding whether she needed to. He stopped at the yard's edge and kept his hands visible. "I'm not with them," he said. She looked at his clothes, his face, the absence of any weapon or horse or traveling companion. Her expression didn't soften exactly, but the calculation in it shifted. "You're not from here," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Where then?" He considered the question seriously. "Somewhere that doesn't exist anymore." That answer should have made things worse. Instead, something in her face settled, as though she'd filed him under a category she already had, the walking wounded, the ones the war had taken everything from. She lowered the axe slightly. "Then you've got that much in common with the rest of us." Her name was Mira. Her husband was the man in the ditch a quarter-mile north. She told him this without ceremony, the way people announce facts they've already survived the shock of. He helped them move the bodies. It was the only useful thing he could do in the next hour, and he understood instinctively that in this world, usefulness was the only currency that bought trust quickly. He carried the dead man back from the ditch, dug with a broken-handled spade until the ground resisted, and worked without speaking while Mira's people watched him with varying degrees of suspicion and exhaustion. While he worked, he looked, not with the perception he'd opened on the road. He kept that closed, unsure yet what it cost him to use it here, but with the ordinary trained attention he'd developed in a world where missing a detail meant dying. The Lannister soldiers had been organized and well-equipped. The raid had a pattern to it: food first, valuables second, horses third. They hadn't lingered, which meant they were moving towards something, not away from it. The war was close. Whatever war this was, it was close. They found him at dusk. He heard them before he saw them, horses moving carefully through the tree line to the east, the particular deliberate quiet of men who hunted other men and had learned that patience was a weapon. Neo set down the water bucket he was carrying and turned to face the road without hurrying. 6 riders emerged from the shadows between the trees. They wore mismatched armor, no single house colors dominant, and their horses were road-worn and honest-looking. At the front rode a man who seemed lit from within by something that had no business being in a human face, one eye covered, the other carrying a quality Neo had encountered once before in a man who had died and come back and never quite finished processing what that meant. Beside him, an older man in a red priest's robes that had seen significantly better decades, watching Neo with the bright, assessing gaze of someone who'd spent a long time looking for something and wasn't sure yet whether he'd found it. "Beric Dondarrion," Mira said quietly from behind Neo, "the Brotherhood." The one-eyed man looked down at the freshly turned earth at the yard's edge, at the survivors gathered behind Neo, at Neo himself. His assessment was thorough and apparently reached a conclusion because the tension in his shoulders released slightly. "You buried them?" Dondarrion said. "They needed burying. Most men coming through the Riverlands right now aren't stopping to notice what needs doing." He dismounted without ceremony, the movement of a man so accustomed to pain that he'd simply reorganized his relationship with it. "You're not from here." "I keep hearing that." The Red Priest, Thoros, Neo would learn, had not dismounted. He was still watching with that searching, flame-bright attention, and when Neo met his gaze directly, something happened in the older man's expression. Not fear, something closer to recognition, which was considerably stranger. "You've died," Thoros said. It came out quiet and certain, the way a physician announces a diagnosis. Neo held the gaze, more than once. "And come back. And come back." Thoros finally dismounted, slowly, like a man moving through water. He circled Neo at a careful distance, not threatening, examining. The other riders watched this with the alert stillness of men used to their priest doing inexplicable things. "The Lord of Light shows me his chosen in the flames," Thoros said, stopping in front of him. "I've seen a man returned from death 6 times." He nodded toward Dondarrion, who accepted this with the weary dignity of someone used to being someone else's theological evidence. "But when I look at you," he paused, working through something, "the fire doesn't show me a man the Lord chose. It shows me something that chose itself, something that looked at death and rewrote the terms." The air between them had taken on a specific quality, the held breath quality of a moment that knows it matters. "I don't serve your Lord of Light," Neo said carefully. Thoros smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd long since made peace with mystery. "No, I don't think you serve anything at all. That's what troubles me." They made camp in the End's common room, the Brotherhood and the survivors sharing space with the uneasy pragmatism of people who understood that warmth and walls mattered more tonight than politics. Neo sat apart, back to the wall beside the cold hearth, and let the room happen around him, while Thoros watched the fire. He'd seen men of faith before. In the Matrix, faith had been a variable, useful, dangerous, occasionally the thing that saved you when logic had run out of runway. Morpheus had carried it like armor. Neo had always been more comfortable with evidence, but Thoros of Mir was something different from the priests he'd been inoculated against by a world that used religion as control software. There was no performance in the man. He'd watched Neo all through the meal with the quiet intensity of a scientist who'd found an anomaly and was genuinely, humbly uncertain what it meant. "Tell me what you see," Thoros said finally across the fire. The other Brotherhood members had the tactical deafness of men trained not to hear their priests' conversations. Neo considered the question. "When I look at this world the way I look at things, the way I can look at things, I see layers, structure underneath structure." He paused. "Back where I come from, that structure was code, built by machines, maintained by machines, exploitable if you knew the language." He looked at the hearthstones, the mortar between them, the faint script-like quality the firelight gave to the grain of the wood. "Here it's different. The structure is alive, it's old, and it didn't build itself, or if it did, it had intentions while it was doing it." Thoros was very still. "You see the weave," he said softly. "I don't know what that means. The Maesters don't believe in it. Most of the faith considers it heresy." The old priest leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice dropping. "But there are older traditions, the priests of Relor among them, that hold the world is not merely matter and time, that beneath it runs a pattern, a weave of power and purpose, and that certain events, certain people are nodes in that pattern, points where the weave pulls tight." Neo thought about what it had felt like to stand in the Matrix's core and hold the entire system in his awareness at once, every signal, every connection, every pulse of data flowing through the greatest prison ever constructed. He thought about the moment he'd understood that the code could be rewritten. "And you think I'm one of those nodes?" he said. "I think," Thoros said carefully, "that the weave doesn't know what you are. I've sat with this fire for 20 years. I've seen it show me kings and their deaths, battles before they're fought, the faces of the faithful and the damned." He gestured at the flames. "Tonight, it shows me you, and it shows me a question it cannot answer. In 20 years, the fire has always had answers." His eyes were steady. "You frighten it." Outside, the riverland's dark pressed against the shuttered windows, and somewhere to the north, Neo knew the war was grinding towards something that no fire had yet named. The Raven reached Varys 3 days after the incident at the Crossroads village. He read it twice, standing at his window in King's Landing, while the city performed its usual symphony of ambition and desperation below. a man of unknown origin, no house, no horse, no allegiance, seen deflecting crossbow bolts in the riverlands, not with a shield, not with armor, but with his hands, moving at a speed that the Brotherhood's own archers described as impossible. Buried the dead of a raided village without being asked, spoke to Thoros of Myr for half the night, left before dawn, alone, heading northeast. Varys folded the letter with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who had learned that urgency was a form of ignorance. In 30 years of gathering information across 2 continents, he had developed a reliable taxonomy of dangerous men. There were men dangerous because of what they commanded, armies, gold, names. Men dangerous because of what they believed. Fanatics were predictable until they weren't. And then there was the rarest category, the one that kept him awake on the nights he permitted himself to be kept awake. Men dangerous because of what they were. Men whose danger wasn't circumstantial. Men who would be dangerous in any room, in any century, regardless of who sat the Iron Throne. He sent 2 ravens, one to a contact in the Riverlands, observe, don't approach, one to a particular friend in Bravos, asking a single question: have the faceless men heard this name? The answer came back in 4 days. They had not, which meant the man had no past in any city where pasts were catalogued. He had simply appeared, fully formed, in a ditch outside Harrenhal. Varys stood at his window a long time after reading that. In the Game of Thrones, every piece had a history you could trace, a weakness you could map, a price you could calculate. An unknown piece with no history, no weakness yet identified, and no evident price was not merely dangerous, it was destabilizing in a way that no army could be. Because armies moved predictably along roads and toward objectives, this man had no objective anyone could name. He dictated a careful note to a young woman named Lara, currently traveling the Riverlands under the guise of a wool merchant's assistant. Her instructions were specific: get close enough to observe, do not be observed observing, report everything, including things that seemed impossible, especially things that seemed impossible. He sent the note and returned to the window. Below, the city churned, Lannister banners snapping in the cold wind off Blackwater Bay, gold on crimson, a lion that had never once in its history considered the possibility of something it could not buy or break. Varys thought about the raven's description again, moving at a speed that the archers described as impossible. He almost smiled. Every era, he had found, eventually produced the thing it needed most and least understood. The question was never whether such things arrived. The question was always who reached them first. He intended to be first.
Harrenhal announced itself on the horizon the way catastrophe always did, slowly, then all at once. Neo had been walking northeast for 2 days through country that had given up pretending to be anything other than a war's digestive tract. Burned farmsteads, roads churned to soup by the passage of thousands of boots and hooves, the occasional figure watching from a tree line, too frightened to approach, too desperate to fully retreat. He moved through it all with the focused quiet he'd learned in a world where stillness was survival, and he watched the code beneath the surface of things pulse and shift with an unease he was only beginning to calibrate. Harrenhal was different. He perceived it before he saw it, a wrongness in the weave, a place where the layered structure of this world's underlying architecture had been scorched into something that hadn't healed and wouldn't. He stopped on the road a quarter-mile out and opened that deeper perception fully, the way you'd open a window in a burning room. What he saw staggered him. The Matrix had taught him that corrupted code had a logic to it. Even damage followed patterns if you looked long enough. He found himself doing that now, tracing the folds and burns in Harrenhal's weave the way he'd once traced the architecture of the source. And as he read, he found something he hadn't expected. At the center of the corruption, beneath 3 centuries of accumulated damage, there was something original. A node, a point where the weave had first been interrupted, not by dragon fire, but by something that had been done here before the dragons came. Something deliberate and very cold. His powers flickered. Not dramatically, not the sudden absence he'd felt at once in the machine city when the world had turned white and impossible. Just a tremor, a half second where the code went soft at the edges of his perception, like a signal losing integrity near a source of interference. He exhaled slowly and closed the deep perception down. Whatever had been done here was old enough and deep enough to push back. He filed that information carefully and kept walking, giving Harrenhal's main gates a wide berth, moving through its outer yard with his eyes on the ground and his awareness of the wrongness beneath his feet turned low. Some wounds, he understood, you didn't probe until you were ready for what lived inside them.
The village was called Alderford, or had been. It sat on the eastern bank of the Red Fork, where the road narrowed between 2 hills, and it was still standing, which, in the Riverlands, meant it hadn't yet been unlucky enough to matter to anyone with an army. 40 people, perhaps, a mill, a sept with a cracked bell, a tavern that served something calling itself ale with the confidence of a man who knows his customers have no alternatives. Neo came in from the South Road in the late afternoon and found the situation in the middle of resolving itself badly. A Lannister officer, young, armored, carrying the specific expression of a man performing authority he hadn't yet earned, had lined 7 men against the mill wall. Village men, working age, some old enough to have sons in somebody's army. The charge, delivered to the gathered villagers with the wooden cadence of rehearsal, was harboring Stark sympathizers. The evidence, as far as Neo could assess from the road's edge, was a Stark sigil pendant found in one man's possession. 11 soldiers, the officer, 7 condemned men, perhaps 30 villagers watching from a careful distance, the particular stillness of people calculating whether any action they could take would help or only add names to the wall. He stood at the road's edge and ran the mathematics. He could stop this. The calculation was simple. 11 soldiers moved at the speed of men, and he moved considerably faster. He could cross the yard before the nearest crossbow was raised and have the officer's sword arm broken before the first bolt was loaded. He could end this in under 4 seconds without killing anyone, and the 7 men against the wall would go home to whatever was left of their lives. He stood there and didn't move. Because he'd been in this world long enough now to understand that the mathematics he was running were the wrong mathematics. He had no idea who those 7 men were. He had no idea what they'd actually done or hadn't done, what web of loyalty and obligation and genuine threat their lives were woven into. In the Matrix, he'd fought agents of a system he understood completely, a system built solely to maintain human imprisonment. He had known with certainty which side was which. Here, every side had a story about why the people on the other wall deserved to be on the other wall. The officer raised his hand. Neo moved. Not to stop the executions, he moved to the officer himself, stepping out of the road and crossing the yard at a pace that was not quite fast enough to be supernatural, but was wrong enough that every soldier in the yard turned before he was halfway there. He stopped 3 feet from the officer, hands open at his sides, and spoke quietly enough that only the man in front of him could hear. "You're about to do something that can't be undone. I'm asking you to consider whether the man who sent you here will remember your name when the consequences of it reach him." He held the officer's gaze. Behind his eyes, the weave of the world pulsed slow and attentive, and he felt, with a clarity that had nothing to do with the Matrix and everything to do with something older, that this moment was a hinge. The officer stared at him. His hand was still raised. The officer lowered his hand, not quickly, not gracefully. He lowered it the way men lower things they've decided to pick up again later when the strange man with the unsettling eyes isn't watching. He ordered the 7 men released with the clipped, face-saving brevity of someone filing the decision under tactical discretion rather than fear, and he took his soldiers back down the South Road before dark. Neo watched them go and felt the weight of the choice settle into him with the particular gravity of things that aren't finished. He stayed in Alderford one night, sleeping in the tavern's back room on a straw mattress that smelled of damp and other people's troubles. He was gone before the village woke. The northeast road narrowed through dense forest for 2 days, and it was on the second afternoon, with the temperature dropping in a way that had nothing reasonable to do with the season, that he found the bodies. 7 of them. Soldiers, different house colors, which meant they'd been traveling together despite faction, which meant they'd been too frightened to travel alone. Whatever had reached them had come from the north side of the road. The trees there were wrong. Not damaged in the way fire or axes damage things. Drained. The bark gray-white and dry as old paper. The branches holding a stillness that was not the stillness of winter, but of something from which all ordinary animation had been removed. He opened his perception carefully. The code was gone. Not corrupted the way it was at Harrenhal, not knotted or scarred or folded back on itself, simply absent, where the weave of the world ran thick and intentional through everything he'd walked through since arriving, through mud and stone and dead men and living fire, and the frightened eyes of a village watching its men lined up against a wall. Here, in the tree line to the north, there was nothing. A silence in the architecture of reality, so complete it had a texture to it. He stood very still in the road and looked at the drained trees and felt for the first time since arriving in this world the particular quality of fear that he associated not with danger but with category error. The fear of encountering something that didn't fit inside any framework he'd yet built. In the Matrix, everything had code. The machines had code. The programs had code. Even the things built to appear organic, appear human, appear real, all of it resolved at sufficient depth into readable structure. The world beneath that structure was mathematics. Mathematics was manageable. The things that had passed through this tree line had no mathematics. He thought about what Thoros had said 4 nights ago by a fire in a village inn. The fire shows me a question it cannot answer. He understood that better now. Some things weren't questions the available language could form. One of the soldiers on the road had been running when he died, had made it 15 feet further than his companions before whatever cold had reached through those trees had finished with him. His face was turned toward the south, toward warmth, toward the world of men and their comprehensible brutalities. Neo crouched beside him and looked north into the absent, silent trees for a long time. Then he stood and kept walking north. They came at midnight, when the cold had become something architectural. Neo had made camp in the shell of a burned watchtower a mile north of the drained tree line, not because it offered warmth, the fire he'd built was losing its argument with the temperature, but because elevation gave him sight lines, and sight lines had kept him alive in worlds considerably more hostile than this one. He sat with his back to the remaining wall and kept his deeper perception open at low threshold, monitoring the weave the way a sailor monitors weather. The signal, or rather the absence of signal, arrived before they did. A spreading null, moving through the world's architecture like a hand passing over a candle. The weave didn't react to it the way it reacted to human presence, to fire, to the particular density of intention that gathered around living things. It simply stopped in a widening radius as the 4 figures emerged from the tree line below. White Walkers moved like winter given purpose. He'd seen things in the Matrix that wore human shape without being human. Agents, programs, the Merovingian servants, and he'd learned to read the tells. The microlag in movement, the eyes processing rather than seeing, the absence of the thousand small inefficiencies that made biological life recognizable as biological life. These things had none of those tells because they weren't mimicking life at all. They were something else, wearing cold as clothing, and they moved through the dark with the unhurried certainty of forces that did not experience the possibility of failure. He came down from the watchtower to meet them in the open ground, not because tactics favored it, because he needed to know immediately whether the rules he operated under had any purchase here at all. He let the first one reach him and didn't move until the last possible instant, then moved, the full bullet time opening like a door in his perception, the world syruping down to fractions. The walker's ice blade tracked toward him in graceful slow motion, and he stepped inside its arc, drove a palm strike into the creature's chest with every physical force he could channel, and felt the impact travel back up his arm like hitting the load-bearing wall of a building. The walker staggered, one step, then steadied. He was already reading the exchange. The blow had connected, force had transferred, the creature had moved, which meant physics still applied. But the code he'd have used in the Matrix to simply rewrite the thing's existence found no surface to grip. There was nothing to rewrite. It was like reaching for architecture and finding wither. The second walker came from his left, and he took the blow across his shoulder rather than his head, the cold of it biting through his jacket with a sharpness that wasn't temperature, but something that wanted to be temperature when it grew up. He rolled, came up, and reassessed with the speed-processed clarity of someone who had died twice and understood that the lesson both times was the same: adapt or end. He fought them as a man, not as the one, not as a being who'd stood at the center of a global simulation and unmade it with his hands, but as Thomas Anderson, who had spent 3 years learning to fight from the best martial artist a simulated reality could generate. He was faster than they expected. He was harder to finish than anything they'd encountered. He used the watchtower ruins, the broken ground, the angle of the slope, making them work for every exchange, buying himself the information he needed. They could be forced back, they could be slowed, they could not, with what he currently had, be destroyed. He broke contact at the fourth exchange, using a burst of speed that finally created enough distance, and ran northeast through the dark, with the cold pressing at his back like a second shadow, learning the shape of what he just survived. Dawn arrived without warmth, a pale and non-committal light that illuminated the landscape without committing to it. Neo sat on a hillside 2 miles from the watchtower and ran inventory. Right shoulder, deeply cold in a way that hadn't changed in 2 hours, the cold sitting inside the joint rather than on its surface, as though the White Walker's strike had deposited something of itself in the wound. He could still use the arm. He filed the cold under monitor and moved on. His powers, intact, fully operational in every mechanical sense. Flight, speed, strength, the combat reflexes that had become as natural as breathing over 3 years of impossible choices. The deep perception, functional, though the hours of sustained use in proximity to that null space had left it feeling scoured, the way eyes feel after staring at something too bright. What he'd lost was the assumption he hadn't known he was carrying. In every world he'd navigated, every system he'd moved through, the deepest truth had been consistent. Reality had structure, and structure could be engaged with, manipulated, rewritten by someone who understood its language well enough. The Oracle had told him that being the One wasn't about power, it was about understanding the nature of the system at a level beyond what the system itself could perceive. The White Walkers existed outside the system, not in opposition to it. Opposition implied a relationship, a push against something that pushed back. They were simply elsewhere, operating from a register of existence that the world's underlying architecture had no syntax for. The weave of Westeros, that old and breathing and intentional thing he'd been reading since he arrived, went silent around them the way all sound goes silent near a great vacuum. Which meant they couldn't be reasoned with at the level he reasoned with things, couldn't be perceived at the level he perceived things, couldn't be rewritten because they weren't written in any language he currently spoke. He sat with that for a long time, watching the pale dawn move across a landscape that had survived centuries of human violence and was now facing something entirely more patient. Then he started thinking practically, which was what he did when the philosophical options ran out. The Brotherhood had Beric Dondarrion, a man killed and returned 6 times by fire, which suggested the Lord of the Light's power had some native relationship with whatever the Walkers were. Thoros had seen him in the flames as something nameless, which suggested the fire recognized him as significant without knowing why. Varys, he'd felt the observation 2 days ago, a pair of eyes in a wool merchant's cart that were considerably more professional than the cover suggested. Varys had networks across the continent and the particular intelligence of someone mapping an unknown piece. And somewhere to the north, beyond the wall, the source of what had passed through that tree line was doing what ancient, patient things did: waiting. He stood, rolled his shoulder experimentally, and looked north with the deep perception fully open, reading the great null space pressing down from beyond the horizon like a second sky. He'd walked into the Matrix's core alone. He'd stood between 2 armies and made a third choice that neither had anticipated. He started walking north, and the world's weave shifted around him, not in fear, not in welcome, but in the particular attention of something very old, recognizing that whatever came next would not be what it had expected.
He had arrived in the Riverlands with nothing. No name anyone recognized, no allegiance anyone could catalog, no history any raven could carry. In the weeks since, he had buried the dead of a village that hadn't asked for his help. He had sat with a red priest by a fire that didn't know what to make of him. He had looked into the ruined architecture of Harrenhal and found something older than its stones. He had stood in a yard in Alderford and made a choice that wasn't a victory and wasn't a defeat and mattered more than either. He had met the thing that existed outside the world's code and learned, painfully and precisely, the shape of what he didn't yet know. The Game of Thrones continued to the south, kings spending lives like currency, each certain their claim was the one that justified the cost. Neo understood claims. He'd been claimed once, by a prophecy, by a system, by the weight of a word, the one, that had turned out to mean something considerably more complicated than anyone had told him. He wasn't anyone's one here. He was simply a man walking north in a world that had its own prophecies, its own chosen, its own ancient machinery grinding toward outcomes written long before he fell through whatever had brought him here. But the cold at the back of his shoulder wasn't fading, and the wall, vast and ancient and humming with something that the world's weave treated with the reverence it reserved for its oldest wounds, was still 300 miles away. He walked, and the pale winter sky held its silence, and somewhere in the deep architecture of a world that had not yet decided what he was, something rewrote a single line of its oldest text, quietly, without announcement, to include him. May the Force be with you. More stories await.